Hello, my name is Talip Küçükcan. I welcome you to TRT World Forum Digital Debates. Today, we are going to discuss U.S. Middle East policy after the Arab Spring. My guest is Dr. Lawrence Pintak. Mr. Pintak, welcome, and we are very pleased to have you today. Before we go on to our discussion, let me introduce you to our audience. Dr. Lawrence Pintak is the author of American Islam, Soundbites, Suicide Bombs, and the Road to Donald Trump, which was published in June 2019. He has also authored The New Arab Journalist and 4 other books that are available covering U.S. policy towards the Middle East and Muslim world. He holds a PhD in Islamic Studies from the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and he is currently the Dean of the Graduate School of Media and Communications at Aga Khan University, East Africa. He previously served as the founding Dean of the Edward Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University, and he was also one of the founding members of the Center for Excellence in Journalism in Karachi. He has covered many areas as a journalist and as an academic. He is currently a non-resident senior scholar at the Middle East Institute and is a frequent contributor to publications such as ForeignPolicy.com, the New York Times, the Daily Beast. Pintak was named as a fellow of the Society of Professional Journalists in 2017 for outstanding service to the profession of journalism. We are very pleased to have you here, Dr. Lawrence Pintak, today. And we are going to look at the U.S. Middle East policy after the Arab Spring. Arab Spring has changed many, I think, dynamics in the region, bilateral relations and also, I think, unilateral issues in our region. My first question to you is the following. Islamophobia has become a major problem for Muslims in the U.S. Moreover, the so-called Muslim ban and Mr. Trump's quarrels with Muslim lawmakers have actually fueled tensions with the Muslim community, which is quite a large one in the U.S., I think. How do you see the future of U.S.-Muslim world relations in this context? Do you have any hopes? Do you have any positive remarks? Is there anything left out there, actually?
Well, I think the first thing would be ask me this question in later November after the election, because that is going to have a fundamental impact on how those relations are shaped. Then there's 2 pieces to it, of course. There's domestically relations with the 3 million or so Muslim Americans, and then there's relationships with Muslim countries and Muslims abroad. Clearly, no matter what happens in the election, Donald Trump has badly damaged relations with American Muslims because we have this schism in the U.S. That is dividing us. And this goes well beyond Islamophobia. This is racism and this is xenophobia.
Well, Dr. Pintak, thank you very much, actually. That's a good introduction. I think we should come together again after the November elections to see how I think these issues will develop. The second issue I would like to raise with you is this us and them dichotomy that we see usually when it comes to the West-Muslim relations or U.S.-Muslim world relations. And there are some books and there are many articles on this subject saying, why do they hate us? Usually, there is an assumption that Muslims hate the West. Whether you agree with that statement or, there are some other issues that needs to be, I think, touched on when it comes to us and them dichotomy. What are the main reasons behind such a polarization?
Well, clearly it's American policy. The fact that the U.S. has systematically launched wars of aggression across the Muslim world. The fact that the U.S. has never truly listened to views from the Muslim world. And of course, we come back to the support for Israel when we're talking about views in the Arab world in particular.
Well, actually, we will come to that. I mean, the unwavering support of U.S. to Israel. So what is the impact of Iraqi occupation in terms of confidence in U.S. policies in the Middle East and beyond, actually? Because I think the invasion of Iraq and also Afghanistan, these played a very important role, especially in the Muslim world when they look at the United States of America.
Right. Muslims and Arabs, their view of the U.S. is shaped by our actions in that part of the world. And those actions have, for the most part, been destructive. Um, Positively and tragically, Barack Obama went to Cairo right after he took office and talked about a new beginning, a new change in relations between the U.S. and the Muslim world, and Arabs and Muslims beyond that. But a few years later, Muslims and Arabs were asking, well, where are the policies that support that? It was all words. There were never actions that followed up to truly change the nature of American policy.
Well, actually, I remember that Barack Obama has also visited Turkey, and he made a speech in the Turkish parliament. And he raised a number of critical issues, and also he talked about U.S. support to human rights, civilization, civilizing mission of the U.S. And of course, he was against all this sort of violation of human rights here and there. What is the mission of U.S. in that regard? I mean, do you think that U.S. really follows this kind of civilizing mission, protecting and preserving human rights issues, or is it just the interest of U.S. That drives U.S. foreign policy, in fact?
Well, naturally, for any country, whether that's Turkey or the U.S. or Israel, policy is driven by self-interest. But one would like to think that at times that policy is shaped by compassion or recognition of the rights of others. That isn't always the case. And the reality is that I think there is an overarching ideal in America that we would be supporting human rights around the world. But when the rubber hits the road, as they say, when we actually get out there, we find that it's a lot harder to do that. And ultimately, the U.S. is trying to support stability and or governments that it likes. And quite often, human rights go out the window. Depends on the president, of course, but quite often that's the bottom line.
Right. I think I raised this question actually with reference to the Arab Spring, because Arab Spring has started with some hopes, especially in the region, because many years, these authoritarian regimes survived, and they had a heavy hand on people, and people has risen. They went out to the streets and they were claiming for their rights, citizenship rights, freedoms, etc., and also wealth and dignity. But when we look at the American policy towards the Arab Spring, can you just please first remind us what was the position of U.S. towards the Arab Spring in the beginning, and of course, whether it has changed gradually?
It was mixed. It was indecisive at some levels. The overarching idea of people rising up in the streets against autocratic regimes certainly resonates with most Americans, and it resonated with the Obama administration. It very much fit within their worldview. But then you got into the realities of, so let's just talk about Egypt. So what can the U.S. actually do? Well, the U.S. could pressure Mubarak to step down. But there was a feeling in the State Department and the White House that if they pressed too hard, Mubarak would push back, and it would be counterproductive. They supported the people in the streets. They supported the idea of democracy, but they didn't really support the Muslim Brotherhood. And they did, however, ultimately acquiesce to the Muslim Brotherhood's election because it was Egypt's first free and fair election. But it was a very complicated situation. I mean, foreign policy is not simple. We go back to the fact that ultimately it comes down to what is your nation's self-interest, and then how do you fit that within the parameters of what's going on the ground. So the U.S. was criticized by both sides, and that's a problem.
Can you please tell us what are the main reasons for policy changes when it comes to the Arab Spring? Because when Arab Spring started, regimes started to change as well. As you have said, Obama administration has at least initially supported people in the street. But when we look at the U.S. policy later on, we see that the U.S. is now siding with Sisi regime again and the other Gulf regimes, which are criticized most of the time because they are non-democratic regimes.
Right. Well, I mean, certainly, let's just start with the fact that the Trump administration is a very different administration than the Obama administration was, or any other for that matter. So there's much more of a sense of cynicism. Cynicism is always woven through every country's foreign policy, but cynicism in spades right now. really the only interest right now is what is perceived by the White House as America's interest, which is usually boils down to what is in Trump's interest.
Right. When we, of course, talk about the Middle East, of course, Egypt, we cannot escape talking about the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization, as a political movement, which existed since the 1930s. What we see is that, they have really worked hard and they have never resorted to violence. They were a moderate, mostly a movement. But all of a sudden, what we have seen in especially last couple of years, this movement is described as a radical one, in some countries actually, including Egypt, it is a terrorist organization. What is the view of US when it comes to organizations such as Muslim Brotherhood? Because if we are looking at some sort of normalization, democratizations, I think we need to have some space for such organizations who never supported violence.
Well, obviously people are accused of referring to the Muslim Brotherhood or Muslims as a monolith, and that is wrong. And the same is true when we talk about the US, because there is no what does the US think? There is what does the current administration think? And what this current administration thinks is a world away from previous administrations and from that of the Biden regime, administration, excuse me. The Muslim Brotherhood, the issues around the Brotherhood are closely tied to domestic American political issues. There is this what used to be the fringe subset of Islamophobes in the US that now sadly have, deep ties into the halls of power. This group has always been against the Brotherhood and have campaigned against the Brotherhood. The argument being that the Brotherhood is, at the ultimate end, infiltrating the US government. And they named individual Muslims in the US government who were supposedly, taqiyya, supposedly undermining America. And it comes down to, if the US were to add the Muslim Brotherhood to the terrorism list, then that would open up all kinds of possibilities for domestic monitoring, surveillance, arrest, etc., of Muslims in the US, because there are so many ties between major American Muslim organizations, the Muslim Students of America, for example, that basically every Muslim student in the US belongs to. Well, that has 2 degrees of separation from the Brotherhood because its founders were Brotherhood immigrants, etc. So this has serious domestic national security implications. And then on the international level, of course, the Gulf Arabs have long campaigned against the Muslim Brotherhood. And so this harks back to America, the Trump administration's relationship with the Emirates and with Saudi Arabia.
Right. I think you are the right person to talk about the varieties of Islam in a sense, because you have a PhD in Islamic studies, and you have already said that this Islam, the Muslim world, is not a monolith, including all the nation states. Within the Muslim nation states, there are lots of varieties. How come then the U.S. administration, also in U.S., there are many strong departments on Islamic studies and in area studies, anthropology, sociology, political science. How come then there is such a monolithic perception of Islam and Muslims, or let's say essentialization of Islam in U.S. policy making circles?
Well, let's talk about the broader public first, and that comes down to ignorance. Most Americans don't know much about Islam. And in fact, when we talk about Islamophobia, all the surveys show that if you have never met a Muslim, the odds are you may be anti-Muslim. If you've met a Muslim, the odds are that you don't see any issue with Muslims or Islam. So there's that. And then when you come to policy circles, again, it comes down to administrations. The Obama administration, clearly Obama had roots in the Muslim world, knew about the Muslim world, so had a different view. And secondly, he had people in the administration who had served long and some of them were Muslims. So they took a very different view than this administration, which started out running against Muslims. This was one of the platforms of the Trump campaign in 2016 and continued in the midterms in 2018, running against Muslims. And we see that happening all over again now. President Trump was at a rally the other night in Minneapolis and ranting and raving about Ilhan Omar, the one of the two American Muslim women in Congress. And she has become kind of a poster child for him in terms of Muslims bad, look at this woman, she's terrible, all Muslims are bad, all immigrants are bad, can't let them in, have to stop them.
Right. Talking about U.S. The Muslim world relations, yes, now we are concentrating on Arab Spring, but I think we should go a little bit back. 9/11, I think, was a turning point in terms of essentializing Muslims or seeing them in a monolithic perception, and also U.S. foreign policy later on, waging war on terrorism, but usually Muslims were the targets, especially some Muslim countries, and also within the U.S. You talked about Muslim Brotherhood when it is listed as a terrorist organization, how it will implicate the national security issues, monitoring Muslims, etc. But in 9/11, that already happened. And what are the consequences of 9/11 in terms of long-term consequences in shaping U.S. mind when it comes to relations with Muslims?
Well, certainly Muslims were othered, to use that academic term, before 9/11. I mean, anti-Muslim attitudes in the U.S. go back before our independence. Early American presidents were accused of being like Muhammad. That was the ultimate insult in American politics back in the dawn of the Republic. The early Christian preachers in New England before independence were fulminating against the Muslim. So this is nothing new. This is a deep-seated thing. And, we can talk about the Crusades and all of that up from both sides, right? How it shapes perception from both sides. But yes, 9/11, obviously, Muslims, in quotes, carrying out an attack in the U.S. Absolutely shaped an entire generation. But remember that we're now into, and as someone who transferred from journalism to academia, now I deal with students, I'm reminded all the time that these students weren't alive at 9/11. So their view, this next generation's view, is much less shaped by 9/11. It's that kind of middle generation that absolutely was shaped. Now these young people are being shaped by Donald Trump. I mean, it's that simple. When you have a president of the United States who is campaigning as one of the pillars of his campaign that Muslims are bad, that shapes the views of an awful lot of people, and not just young people, but many people.
Right. When we talk about U.S. policy towards Muslims, of course, the Middle East is a key, I think, region because there is a significant population. There are many nation states, and there are some also critical issues like invasion of Iraq and also the Syrian crisis after the Arab Spring. It seems that the U.S. has established, some kind of working relations with many other regimes, but when it comes to Syria, this is not the case. How do you think the Syrian uprising or Syrian conflict influenced U.S. policy towards Middle East?
Well, I think once Trump came into office, I don't think it had that fundamental an impact on shaping our approach to the region. I don't need to tell you how complicated the Syrian conflict is. And we as Americans tend to oversimplify everything in the Middle East. I'm not sure you mentioned early on, I was CBS Middle East correspondent in the 80s. And saw the many, based in Beirut, the many levels of complication of the Middle East. And that rarely ultimately shapes our view of the region. We tend to simplify things, bring things down to black and white. Ronald Reagan in Beirut, it was good guys and bad guys, white hats and black hats. et cetera, et cetera. So, and I think the fact that Syria was so complicated that it did not directly impact Americans. When oil is disrupted, that impacts Americans. When a place like Egypt is in turmoil, all right, it's the biggest country in the Middle East, so ultimately there are ripple effects. But Syria, as tragic and as horrible as the death toll in Syria, did not have a direct impact. It all comes back down to how does it threaten Israel, of course. So I don't think that Syria truly shaped this administration's approach to the Middle East. And we saw the quick turnaround on turning against the Kurds and abandoning the Kurds from the perspective of many, how simply and quickly that was done, how quickly it was, we're going to pull out of Syria completely, then, oh, well, no, actually we're not. So that reflects a failure to understand, while separately, the administration is razor focused on this relationship with Saudi Arabia.
Right. I think you have raised very fundamental issue. You said the Middle East's U.S. policy is, to some extent, maybe to a large extent, is shaped by several concerns. And one concern is the security of Israel or the safety of Israel. Can you expand on that, please? Because the Arab Spring, some argued that Arab Spring, if it was going to be very successful, it would have had some impact on the regional balance of power. Therefore, the U.S. and other states were at some stage, they changed their mind. Instead of supporting Arab Spring, they said, okay, we should keep the status quo rather than supporting transformation in the region.
Well, I think that's a complicated question. I think the support in terms of the Arab Spring had much to do with the fact that there were few alternatives, because the autocrats had never allowed true civil society to flourish. And so Egypt, for example, the only alternative was the Muslim Brotherhood, which the U.S. didn't really like, but again, the Obama administration acquiesced to. But, a Jordan, a Bahrain, if you don't know what's coming next as a policymaker, it makes it very hard to support that change because, it's the old line about the wrong people get elected. And that exactly was what was on the cards. The Middle East would have been in serious turmoil for a long time, whether that was just domestically or the spillover on Israel, because of course, Israel, once a population is coalescing around something, often it's in the Arab world, often it's coalescing around a hatred of Israel. It's the one thing that unites people. So yes, Israel certainly played a calculation, but likewise, what would, and I'm not defending the policies, but what would have happened in Saudi Arabia if the Arab Spring had spread to there, or if the Muslim Brotherhood's influence had spread to there? That again goes back to directly impacting American policy.
Dr. Pintak, as you have said and indicated, both during the Obama, at least during the last, period of Obama, and also the Trump administration, they have, very often expressed their wishes to withdraw from the Middle East, at least from Iraq and from Syria. But also, when we talk about this, there are some other, I think, actors that came in. Iran, for example, Russia, they have expanded their spheres of influence. What is the view of U.S. when they are withdrawing, some other countries are filling the gap? Well,
this is the $1,000 question. What does Donald Trump even think about this? The idea, there's a whole conversation about his relationship with Russia. Is this something he actually wants to happen? But the idea that the Russians are filling the gap and even the Chinese are dancing around the edges, and obviously Iran has massively extended its influence. How does he view that? I don't know. And I know, I don't know many people that do. The reality, of course, though, is that yes, Russia, which had never had any significant influence in the Middle East, is now back with vigor. And Iran is more powerful than ever. 40 years ago this week, I was sitting in Baghdad covering the first days of the Iran-Iraq war. And at that point, the US was quietly supporting and helping both sides because it was a good thing for Iran and Iraq to be locked in battle because they couldn't mess with anybody else. And Saddam, whatever you want to say about him, was keeping Iran in check. Now Iran is powerful across the region. This idea of the Shia crescent that various people have talked about has become a reality. You know, you can go from Iran to Beirut without stopping, without, you know, going through Sunni territory, as it were. And clearly, the interest of Saudi Arabia in siding with the U.S. and this myopic view in the White House about Iran has played into the Saudi desire to solidify this wall against Iran. Iran is evil incarnate in the eyes of Saudi Arabia. And remember back to Trump's first visit abroad was to Saudi Arabia, where he underlined that idea that Iran was evil incarnate. And of course, it was ostensibly a summit about stopping terrorism when ISIS was on the rise, but the whole focus was Iran, who was actually stopping ISIS. So there's no logic in terms of being a foreign policy expert, analyzing what's good, what's bad for the US, et cetera, et cetera. Those logical pieces are not being applied to American foreign policy right now.
So when we talk about Syrian issue, of course, I mean, Turkey-US relations also need to be addressed, because in the early stages of uprising, I think both countries has some sort of common policy, political transition, gradually some sort of democratization, etc. But later on, we have seen some divergence. At the end, some conflicts in the relationship. How do we evaluate this gradual worsening of the relations between these two old allies?
Because it's a complicated relationship with two countries that have ulterior motives, have their own self-interest, and B, it gets down to the simplified view of the region from the White House. Donald Trump likes autocrats, and with all due respect, your president is an autocrat. So they got on well in those terms. But then suddenly he was doing things that conflicted with what Trump wanted to see happen. Given that Donald Trump has not had a key advisor or secretary of anything in his cabinet who has been there for the long haul, given that Donald Trump turns on his supporters, his loyalists at the drop of a hat, it's not a great surprise that he turns on an international ally because the wind blew in the wrong direction.
Mr. Pintak, the Daesh emerged in that region, especially in Syria. It's not only Daesh actually, but some non-state actors have emerged in our region because of the lack of or the insufficient central governments, because of the conflict, etc. And of course, fighting Daesh or combating Daesh was a common ground for many, I think, countries, including Turkey and US. But US started also supporting PKK-related YPG, and Turkey sees this organization as an existential threat to its own security. I think this was one of the lines that both countries differed. Do you think that Turkey was not able to convey this message, or the US did not want to understand it? Because as clearly Turkey, I think, has proven that this organization is related to PKK, which Turkey has been fighting for the last 40 years.
Well, obviously, there's a whole show to be done on that topic. But in terms of why the U.S. turned on Turkey, as it were, did it not understand? This comes back down to self-interest. The Kurds of all stripes were fighting alongside the U.S. against Daesh. And Daesh was the enemy. It was the goal. nothing else mattered. And if you look at the history of American foreign policy and you look at our actions around the world, we have long fought with bad guys against other bad guys, because the old enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? And so the top priority from, again, coming back to America's self-interest, was to stop Daesh. I mean, ISIS was the overarching enemy in every way, shape, and form. That's all people talked about in the US. And so from an administration standpoint, stopping them was priority number one. Who we worked with to get there didn't really matter. Remember, in getting there, we quietly worked with Iran as well, because some of those campaigns against ISIS were unofficially, quietly coordinated with Iran, with Iranian troops on the ground and Iranian-backed militias on the ground and American air support, etc. So it's not at all surprising. I think what was more surprising to policymakers and the military was that ultimately the administration did turn on PKK, and that was an internal surprise, I think.
Right. Of course, the Turkish-Russian relations have some influence on the U.S. view of Turkey here. I think that's very clear. But Turkey justifies its decision to buy, defense mechanisms or technology from Russia simply because U.S. did not respond it very positively. How it is read by the U.S. administration? Because in Turkey argues that there was no other option but getting closer to Russia, because U.S. was withdrawing from the region and Russia was filling the gap. So Turkey had no other, let's say, alternative.
Again, this comes back to who are we talking about? So if you talk about experts on the region in the State Department, those few that are actually left, they're going to completely understand Turkey's move. It is almost automatic. And again, we've seen this in many other places, where if we come into a conflict with some group of some ally, and suddenly with that ally we've turned on them, we're not providing the same support, or we're saying bad things about them, well, we push people into others' arms. Again, you go back to what's happening in broader terms in the region. Russia is increasing its influence because we're pushing people into their arms. So I think from a policymaker think tank perspective, what Turkey's doing is to be expected. I think from a White House perspective, it gets back down to, you're supposed to be completely loyal to me, and who do these people think they are? And well, if they're going to do that, screw them.
Right. So we briefly talked about U.S. support to Israel. That is a unconditional support since the establishment of Israel. Of course, there are many reasons behind it. But what are the implications and consequences of such sort of long-term unconditional support to Israel in the region, and also U.S. Middle East relations when it comes to...
Well, there's the domestic side and the international side. On the domestic side, we have seen much more pushback against unconditional support for Israel. I mean, there is, certainly for the rest of my lifetime, America is going to support Israel at some level. The pushback has been supporting this government in Israel and these policies in Israel. So even among Israel supporters, there's a lot of concern about supporting somebody who has these kind of, what ultimately comes down to, racist views and policies. That said, the U.S. is not going to turn on Israel anytime soon, that's for sure. And that has ongoing, it has had implications for the region since the 1940s and will continue to do so. And obviously, we see the implications of that in this new peace deal. And I'm sure you'll want to talk about that more.
So I will come to that point, but more specifically, I would like to refer to your studies, actually, because in your studies, you have underlined the fact that this unconditional support for Israel and disregard of the oppression to which Palestinians have been subjected for a long time ignited so-called jihadism in the Muslim world. And I think Muslims are now blamed because jihadism is there, but I think you have rightly explained that this is some sort of natural consequences of such a policy, some sort of reactionism in the Muslim world?
I think we need to be careful in looking at the reasons for jihadism, for extremism. There are many, and Israel is one of them. Certainly, the arrival of satellite television, Al Jazeera first, where people across not only the Arab world but the broader Muslim world were seeing the consequences of American actions. That drove attitudes around Israel to places like Indonesia, where they never cared about Palestinians before. Suddenly they were. But the Israel issue, clearly violence in Palestine radicalizes Palestinians. But it is not the primary reason for radicalization elsewhere. It was not, the reason Al-Qaeda suddenly appeared. It was not the reason that bin Laden turned on the House of Saud and ultimately ended up carrying out anti-American actions. It wasn't the reason for the birth of ISIS, but it is an element. I think someone has a microphone open somewhere in a kitchen. Are you hearing all of that background noise?
At the moment, not really. Is it from my side or from?
It's not from my side. There's nobody else here.
Right.
So.
Okay.
And it just went away. So maybe it was a producer or something.
Right. Okay. My last question, we are running out of time, is the so-called normalization process between some Gulf countries, between Arab countries and Israel. The U.S. Seems to have mediated the normalization process between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and also later on Bahrain joined the club. It seems that there are some other, I think, Arab countries who will follow the suit. How do you think the recent deals will shape the U.S. perception among citizens of Arab countries, particularly those that saw large pro-democracy movements a decade ago during the Arab Spring?
Well, I think in terms of how it shapes Middle East public opinion, you're probably in a better position than I am to talk about that. But there are many in this relationship between Israel and Gulf states has been an open secret for a very long time. All this deal is doing is putting on the table what has been going on under the table for a very long time in terms of quiet trade connections, in terms of support around intelligence operations, security operations. And so I think there are many in the population in the Gulf who will welcome this. There are many others who will say this is an abandonment of the Palestinians. But it's not a peace deal. You can't have a peace deal involving countries that weren't at war. This is a normalization of an existing relationship, and ultimately it's a photo op. And the odds that we're going to have another photo op next month that involves Saudi Arabia, what we call in America the October surprise before the election, I think is probably very high.
Then what would happen to the Palestinians? I mean, what do they get from this sort of deal?
Nothing. They are abandoned. They are, look at the Kurds, look at the Kashmiris. That's what the Palestinians become. The Palestinians' only difference between them and the others I just mentioned is that they are still sitting there on Israel's doorstep. And when they carry out acts of violence against Israel, it will get attention in the U.S. But sadly, if we go way back in history, why was the PLO formed? Why did the PFLP start carrying out acts of terrorism? Munich massacre, the hijackings, was because nobody was paying attention to them. And the great danger here is that we push some element of the Palestinians, aside from Hamas in Gaza, but we push them back into some level of international terrorism because they have no other choice right now. We can only hope that that begins to change again if there's an administration shift.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lawrence Pintak, for joining at the TRT World Forum Digital Debates. Now we come to the end of this session, talking about U.S. Middle East policy after the Arab Spring. We hope to see you next time. Goodbye to all.